Gillette, the best a man can get.
Back here, first things first, Super Bowl champ Chris Canty is here. What's going on, Chris? How was your weekend?
Nothing much, Jenna's. Good weekend, wild card weekend, some good football, so solid.
All right, you want to talk about some of it?
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. Why don't we start with Phillip Rivers and the Chargers in Baltimore. All eyes on that guy, Lamar Jackson, in his first playoff start. Second quarter, Chargers up 6. Lamar's pass picked off. Rough first half for him. So rough, the Twitter world begging for a switch to Joe Flacco. But the Ravens stuck with Lamar, who halfway through the fourth quarter, 3 of 10, 25 yards, 0 quarterback rating. But in the fourth, Lamar found Michael Crabtree, cuts the lead to 13. Less than 2 minutes to go. Lamar, Crabtree again. That made it a one-score game. This took a while, but touchdown would eventually be called. Lamar would get a shot to win it, but Melvin Ingram recovers the fumble, and this would end the game. Chargers win 23-17. Here's Lamar Jackson on his day.
Just played like we didn't want to be here. I did, not my team. I feel like I played poorly. You know, it was a lot of things, you know, we could have did out there on that field to put us in a better situation. Just got to move on now and get ready for next year.
All right, see, Chris Canty, how did they do it? How did the Chargers shut down Lamar Jackson yesterday?
Well, I think the Chargers did some interesting things on the defensive side of the ball, personnel packages. You know, they were missing Brandon McBain. He's dealing with a family matter, something going on with his daughter. And then, of course,
he's the big defensive tackle, which is typically a two-gap space mover. Has been a really good player.
He's one of the best run-stoppers in the National Football League. And then they were missing their second leading tackle, middle linebacker, Jatavis Brown. So they had to be creative in terms of their personnel, and I think they had a lot of speed on the field, and they were able to neutralize some of the concepts that Marty Morningwig was utilizing Lamar Jackson in. So I think that was the big difference in terms of what the Chargers defense was able to do. Ball security showed up. I think that was a big issue. It's been an issue for Lamar Jackson. 9 straight games with a fumble. That's something that has to be concerning, seeing as how he's the guy that touches the ball the most with that Baltimore Ravens team. So something that he's got to get cleaned up in the future. But I think the biggest issue going into that game for the Ravens offense is just the inexperience of the quarterback in the postseason. He's the youngest quarterback to start a playoff game in the National Football League. And say what you want, but if you haven't been there, if you haven't played in a playoff game in the National Football League, then you don't understand what the speed, the intensity, and the urgency is like.
Canty, were you concerned during the week? Because I had concern. I saw a soundbite of Lamar. And he said, it's just another game. And I was like, okay, I want to watch how that plays out compared to some of the other quarterbacks and what they were saying about the playoff and the speed of the playoff.
Well, I saw what you were talking about last week, and you're right. It's not just another game because it's win or go home. And so everybody is approaching the game with a different mentality. You try to manage that as best you can, but you do understand these types of games are just a little bit different. And Lamar Jackson wasn't able to adjust to the overall tempo of the game. You saw that. He wasn't getting the ball out on time. He got sacked 7 times. The turnovers, those things can't happen if your team is going to have a chance to win those types of games.
There was 2 things from an inexperienced standpoint I was worried about going into the game. I was worried about Anthony Lynn, his lack of being a coordinator, and him lack of being a head coach in his first playoff experience in his second year. But because he's got Ken Wisenhunt on the offensive side, former head coach, and he's also got Gus Bradley, former defensive head coach. But on the defensive side, Gus Bradley came to him early in the week after experimenting with some things in walkthrough, saying, I believe we should play 7 defensive backs. And the only reason why he's able to do that was, you mentioned the injury, especially inside linebacker. But they got a special talent in Derwin James and his ability to be able to play in the box like he did Florida State. Now, there's only one reason why I compare him to the late, great Sean Taylor, and it's because he has such versatility, he's got such speed, he's such a great tackler in space, and Gus Bradley coming up with this new wrinkle that we hadn't seen in the NFL. It was kind of like Tim Tebow when he won his first playoff game. The Pittsburgh Steelers hadn't seen him yet. This Chargers team, they were able to see Lamar for the second time, and them making that adjustment, I thought, was the key to the game. And not only did they play 7 defensive backs, but watch how many times they played Ingram and Boza on the inside in that guard tackle gap where they were able to utilize their quickness, where typically you got a space eater in those positions.
So a number of really key points that you mentioned. One, this is the first time in Lamar Jackson's career since at least high school and maybe before that a team's played him twice in a year. So they got to see him and then they got to adjust from there. Secondary.
And a couple weeks ago.
Right,
I mean,
absolutely.
Very
it was
recently.
very recently.
Yeah.
So that never happened in Louisville. It hadn't happened in the NFL because he took over midway through the year. So those divisional opponents, he only played them one time. The other part, Derwin James, a guy whose name we talked about before they played the first time. The reason you can play 7 DBs is because they were kind of at some points playing 6 DBs and 1 linebacker, but the linebacker was their safety, Derwin James, because he can do it all, first team All-Pro as a rookie. And the other point, and see, this is something we talked about before the show, because you would think, I think most football fans would say, okay, if I'm playing a team that is limited passing but is dominant running, I want more big people rather than more small people. They went with speed over strength, but that can only work if their defensive line makes sure the offensive line is not getting to the second level and obliterating all the corners they have on the field blocking, right?
I mean, well, that's why they came out in a reduced front, right? They had 2-3 techniques and a 0 nose. So, I mean, you can do those types of things. You can keep the guards in the center from climbing to the second level if you've got guys on top of them. And I think that's exactly what they did. Another guy that I keep calling to San Diego, that the Los Angeles Chargers used in the box, Adrian Phillips. We got to give him some love, too, because he played big yesterday as well, came up with that interception in the first half, which was a huge play. But, I mean, for as well as the Chargers defense played, the Baltimore Ravens defense played equally as well.
Yes,
I mean, they had a couple of sudden change situations in the first half. I mean, Kenneth Dixon fumbles the ball. The Chargers get the ball in point-blank range. They get a tackle for loss on 3rd down and hold them to a field goal.
And they blocked a field goal. They blocked a punt, did the Ravens.
That was in the 3rd quarter. You had 2 block kicks and a fumble recovery, and you only get 3 points out of that.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, if that's the case, if that's what's going to happen, then you're not going to have a chance to win that game.
But obviously one of the big themes throughout the game was when you start hearing the fans and the Twitter world and all of it calling for them to change to Joe Flacco. Where do we fall on that?
Listen, can I just remind everyone what Joe Flacco, Super Bowl winner, Joe Flacco looked like in his first playoff start? Put it side by side, Joe Flacco versus Lamar. Now, the only difference between these two games, aside from the fact Lamar had a nice run in the 4th quarter, is Flacco actually got a quarterback win for that start. His year 2 for Joe Flacco, he got a road win against New England, 33-14. With 4 completed passes and 34 yards passing. Like, this is why the quarterback wins thing can be misleading. And the idea that Joe Flacco, I watched him play this year. The idea that he all of a sudden was going to come in and lead you from 3 scores down, that he was going to be the cure-all, that doesn't exist.
I don't think they were calling for Joe Flacco because they all thought Joe Flacco was the better quarterback, but maybe that they needed a change, that the game had gotten too big, the stage was too large, the lights were too bright for Lamar Jackson.
I think Lamar fumbled the ball in the first quarter 3 times. So sitting there saying, anybody thinking about Joe Flacco is crazy? No, you're watching a football game, and this is the stage too big for this kid who is the youngest, who turns 22 today. The stage did look too big for him. He began to shrink. As the playoffs went up, he began to shrink, and he was having a hard time with just your basic throws. When you run an out and he bounces the ball on 2 bounces to the wide receiver, it is in the books that you should look to a veteran quarterback. So thinking that the fans and everything were crazy this time, no, they weren't. Lamar was playing that bad that you had to consider it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to consider it, but you also have to think that it could affect the confidence of your young quarterback moving forward.
And that's why
we know that confidence is important to the development of young players, but especially at the quarterback position.
All right, we got to take a break. Chris, stick around. Coming up, how was Nick Foles able to keep this playoff run alive? That's next on First Things First.
Come on, Jenna, you wanted to say magic. Don't be scared of Chris Carter.